we're going to get underway. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to Avid Reader. It's my pleasure to be here with you all tonight. My name's Bianca, and I'd like to start this evening's event by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are gathering, the Yagara and Turrbal people. I pay my deepest respects to all elders, past, present, and emerging. And I am humbled to say that this has always been and will always be a place of creativity, community, and storytelling. Now is time to please switch your phones to silent if you haven't already. However, feel free to indulge in as much social media as you like. If you're on Twitter, we've got a few avid Twitterers in the audience. We are at Avid Reader 4101 if you're on Twitter. And tonight. So I will just mention briefly for our in-person guests this evening, we've got a pretty much a nearly full house, which is excellent. So just one note on housekeeping. If at any time during the event you do need to use the bathroom, it's just in to your right. So be to your right and just down where the light is on. So thank you. That's all I'll say there. And so tonight we are joined by Griffith Review Senior Editor Carity Culver in conversation with three authors featured in Griffith Review 72, States of Mind, Kate Cole-Adams, Neeraj Gill, and Kyle Perry, to explore the power of dreams, the pull of the subconscious, and the possibilities for reshaping our mental health care. This edition showcases a powerful combination of personal voices and expert opinion, and is a deeply personal interrogation of discovery, resilience, loneliness, joy, grief, and our past and future selves. The evening will also feature a performance by poet and self-proclaimed mischief maker, Lockie Little, whose work and voice also appears in States of Mind. Copies of Griffith Review 72 are available at the counter, as well as we'll be sending through a link to our Zoom audience for where to purchase that online. They're available, and there will be time for Q&A for both our live audience and those joining us on Zoom. But feel free to send through your questions on Zoom beforehand. We'll get a bit of a gauge of the audience at about 7:20 to see how many have questions, and otherwise I'll pass over to Carity, and please give our panel a very, very warm welcome. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bianca. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much for coming, whether you're here in the room at Avid or joining us on Zoom. So, of course, as Bianca said, we're here to launch the brand new edition of Griffith Review, States of Mind, this beauty here. This is a book that explores the personal and the political. It's about our minds and our mental health models. It's about how we feel and how we live. And it's also about what happens when dreams meet reality. So it asks some pretty big questions, and I can't promise that we'll have all of the answers tonight, but what I can promise is a fantastic reading and a fascinating conversation. So, to kick things off, I am delighted to welcome Lockie Little, one of our States of Mind contributors, who's going to do a reading for us. Here is his bio. Do you want me to read your bio? Because it's a work of art. It really deserves to be read. Lockie is a Jabba man based on Melbourne Bay country, Gold Coast. He is a musician, a poet, a producer for Digi Youth Arts, and now apparently a writer. Perhaps just an all-around ink spiller. Snake of Light, his piece in States of Mind, is a theme and entity Lockie has been playing with through writing, poetry, and music for years. His band Selves have an EP and song by the same name. Snake of Light is part of a longer story being told by Lockie through a number of mediums. If anyone knows of any help circles for people who spontaneously metamorphose into luminous snakes, please contact Griffith so that Lockie can get some guidance for this strange, unique experience. Take it away.
Thank you very much. Wait, I'm loud. Okay, so I'm going to stand in front of you guys and probably pace. Hello. Hello. Get a little bit of feedback over there. That's all right. It's all part of the charm. I'm going to squeeze a few little poems into this and try to keep it within a good time frame. Maybe I should just hold it back a little bit like this.
Sorry, I was thinking. This land is my elder. And even though it has been generations and generations since I have been back there, my home just north of the Kimberley, just south of Cape Leveque, its hand still guides me. Its finger outstretches and the branches and the leaves sheltering me as I walk slowly by the waters of Currumbin Creek. Its finger outstretches in the spray of stars as I walk alone beneath Chugan's midnight beach from flat rock to the cusp of the alley, my mind blending in the estuary where the old voices whisper in the waves like pages unfolding on the shore, shedding sheets of the oldest story ever told if I only care to listen, if I only care to read. If I only care to retrace the passages of my blood to the cursive lines of the Kimberley where waves of stone mount over me and secrets dance around ancient fires and great-great-grandparents sit around in perfect silence and look at me. Directly through the long lens of time, painting my mind with memories of my bloodline, patterns of eucalypt that blink behind my eyes as they open to the moon shimmering on the beach, as they open to the dew glimmering white upon the leaves, and suddenly it dawns on me that my country is all around, that I am the estuary where the river meets the sea, and that even though my family was stolen over centuries and crammed into seething cities, my ancestors do still see me, and I can still be a grandson who carries on the dream. And although I was raised without my elders around me, without their hands to guide me, soothe me, teach me, paint me with their hands like rivers and their hands of shelter, this land itself has been my elder. And I will cross the empty desert of our dark, dark times to reconnect to my bloodline so that my kids don't have to grow up walking blind, trying to find the ancient light that is their fucking birthright. And this is why I wade up to my knees in the estuary and pray into the high, wide night for black lives and treaties to be signed, so that our culture can be kept alive and never again be as hard as it has been for this lost blood to find. So that we can look into each other's eyes and reside in the hands of our elder, in the hands of this land. Thank you.
Bravo.
Yeah, this is like one I wrote a while ago. I was hosting poetry for a very long time, and it's about, I guess, like the clash of idolatries. A lot of people in my generation, very much worshipping all the usual suspects, and just even thinking about in the creative realms how people are still so much more interested in idols from across the seas than the rich culture that we have here. So this is called "There Are No Aboriginal People on the Road." There are no Aboriginal people on the road, so where should I hitch my thumb? Would Kerouac with his lucid eyes care about what stars were broken in our ancient skies? Will our stories of secret time be worthy of your archives? Will our elders be leather-bound, wrapped and stacked beside the Odyssey and Iliad, Hemingway and Upanishads, Nietzsche and Huxley, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Shakespeare, and the trillion arms of Hermann Hesse? Do we not have a library full of meaning worth walking through and reading? You see, our languages are ageless, whereas your words are still just teething. What you are all seeking, we have always been speaking, but there is no use in pleading to ears hard of hearing. You all have your big dreams of artistry, of screaming crowds and publishing, a tower stacked of burning books, a lake of ink and a diamond brook. You scream for a revolution and a paradise you took. If you want a revolution, you'll have to climb inside of our song, for we are the ones who've been here all along. We are the ones through which the rainbow serpent slithers while the city shimmers and shivers, and if you want to shed the skin of this psychospheric system, you'll have to do it with us. But there are no Aboriginal people in your acid revelations and Jimi Hendrix songs. There are no Aboriginal people in Jim Morrison's dreams or the thoughts of Sigmund Freud. Perhaps besides the never-ending music festival headlining Carl Jung and the archetypes, we just seem relatively uninterested. Which is why we have to fight our way into your books, because it's the only way our culture gets a second look. So let us dance while we skin your romantics on the fire. Say a prayer for your angels as we enter into revelry around your literary pyre. Thank you very much.
My pleasure to introduce you to our three wonderful panelists. To my left, Neeraj Gill, Neeraj Gill is a psychiatrist and professor at the School of Medicine, Griffith University. He is an elected director on the board of the Royal Australia and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists. He was awarded a Doctor of Public Health degree from the University of New South Wales in 2020, based on his doctoral thesis on human rights of people with mental disabilities. He's also a former Chief Psychiatrist of Queensland. In the middle, Kyle Perry. Kyle Perry is based in Hobart. His debut novel, The Bluffs, has been shortlisted for Dimmock's Book of the Year, Indie's Debut Fiction of the Year, and International Thriller Writer's Best First Novel, and it was longlisted for the Australian Book Industry Awards General Fiction Book of the Year. His highly anticipated second book, The Deep, will be released this July. Kyle has a degree in counselling and coaching and works for Tasmania's peak body of alcohol and other drugs. And last but not least, Kate Cole-Adams. Kate Cole-Adams is a Melbourne-based writer and journalist. Her 2017 book, Anaesthesia, Gift of Oblivion and the Mystery of Consciousness, won the Mark and Evette Moran Mid-Literary Award and was shortlisted for the 2018 Victorian Premier's Literary Awards Non-Fiction and the Melbourne Prize Best Writing Award. So welcome, Kate, Neeraj, and Kyle. It's great to have all of you here. Your pieces in this edition of GR are all really different, but each one presents a fascinating take on this broad idea of states of mind. So Neeraj, your essay tackles the intersection between mental health and human rights. Kate, your reportage piece investigates the use of psychedelics to treat various medical conditions. And Kyle, your memoir piece questions the interplay between your work as a counsellor and your recent success as a best-selling novelist. One common thread that runs through all three pieces is this idea of dreams and the subconscious. So that's where I thought that we would start the conversation tonight. Neeraj, can you tell us about that dream that you described so beautifully at the start of your piece in States of Mind and the effect that it had on you?
Thank you. That's a great common thread that you picked up, Caroline. Dreams are very personal, and so was my dream. This was a dream that I had about 10 years ago. I was in a luxury resort with my wife and my daughter, who was about 3 years old at the time. There were lots of swimming pools, there was a lake, there were birds, there was sunshine, people playing netball, sipping wine. And then I came across an empty swimming pool, which was a very large pit. And I saw that on the bottom of the pit, there were a lot of people. They were old, bald, emaciated, and wearing a uniform. And I realized in my dream that within this luxury resort, there was a mental asylum, mental institution. Some of those people stretched their arms and silently pleaded to me to pull them out. But I walked on. I pretended that I didn't see them. I was on a family holiday. I couldn't spoil my holiday with my family for those people. Then there was a question about where would I take them if I do pull them out. That was a dream, and I've written about it 10 years later because it had a powerful effect on me. Because in the dream, within my dream, there's a conflict. So I'm a psychiatrist, and at the time I had moved to a regional area in Queensland, and there was a position on offer for clinical director of the mental health service, which included a mental institution, mental asylum, where people had been for years, sometimes for decades. And I had this conflict whether to take up that position or to sort of have an easy life, relaxed and dedicated to my lifestyle. So that conflict reflected in my dream. And it also, my dream also recapitulated a lot of memories from a mental asylum that I had been to 15 years ago, 15 years prior in a small town in India, where I had seen a lot of people in that condition, incarcerated for decades. And I also recalled that the image of outstretched arms was probably from a person, a photograph that I had seen in a newspaper from the first tragedy on Christmas Island, when about 50 people died when they both instructed. And there was this image of an outstretched hand of a person, which was probably their last cry for help. And so the dreams, they have all these niche, unconscious mind collects all these niches, and then they combine into an image, and that was my dream. It had a powerful effect. And I thought that was my beckoning call, and I accepted the position after that dream.
Thank you. It's pretty amazing what our unconscious minds can dredge up when we're looking the other way. Kate, this seems to be sort of a common thread in your work. So, of course, you've got your piece in States of Mind, but you had a book in 2017, Anaesthesia, which explores what happens to us when we go under, how our unconscious mind copes with being anaesthetized. Can you describe the path that led you as a writer from anesthetics to psychedelics?
Well, look, I'd say I have had a long preoccupation with unconscious and subconscious states, and also with altered states of consciousness. And that's gone through, like when I look back, that's gone through my work for quite a while. And my first novel was about a woman who's just woken up from a coma. And I've done research on somatization and the sort of, unconscious ways in which the body will express conflict that we can't speak about otherwise. And so I think, when I started reading about psychedelics and this kind of move towards psychedelic healthcare, psychedelic medicine, and the interest of, Western medicine trying to kind of corral this strange and mysterious process to treat mental illness, it kind of fell right into my area of fascination. And but while I was researching my book on anaesthesia, I'd actually come across a study which fascinated me, which was actually it's quite well known. It's called the Good Friday experiment, and this was an experiment that took place in the early 1960s in the US, where a researcher, they basically wanted to figure out whether psychedelic drugs could elicit a genuine kind of religious experience. And so they took a group of people to a chapel, I think at Boston University, and essentially told them that they were going to be having, that they were looking for some kind of transcendent experience, and gave half of them hefty doses of psilocybin, which is basically magic mushrooms, and gave the others like some very boring niacin pill or something, and set them on their way. And basically what came out of it was that it was impossible for the researchers not to know almost instantly who had what. And the thing that really fascinated me was that the experiences that that all of the people who had taken the drugs had that came back and reported these profound experiences of transcendence, of touching some kind of sort of God or religious kind of moment, except for the one guy who actually tried to escape, and they had to chase him down the street. And I've always been interested in how did that guy end up? Because all the other guys, when they were interviewed years later, were still saying that this was either the or one of the peak experiences of their lives. So that got me interested from the start. And then when I started researching, it was just so fascinating. And I sort of found that there was a lot that was quite similar to, the conversation about anaesthetics and this process, which is, these drugs which create this profound effect, which is not fully understood. This kind of grey area between, with anaesthetics, between what's conscious and unconscious. And, when you look at psychedelics, it's this kind of, this incredibly intense experience. But it's like where that intensity and all that kind of wildness actually then blends back into day-to-day life, and what the sort of boundaries are between what you bring into the experience and what you take out of the experience. And that really fascinates me because, and that was one of the things in anaesthesia. No one thinks that anyone takes anything in or comes out with anything, but actually that's not so. And so I guess it made sense for me to dive into this pool again in a way. Yeah.
Fascinating stuff. Kyle, you sort of go on your own very intense inner journey in your piece, which explores kind of the flip side of a dream come true. So The Bluffs was a huge success. Your debut novel came out last year. It was your 11th manuscript after the first 10 were rejected. So can you tell us what drove you to keep writing and keep that dream alive?
How are you all doing? We all right? Having a good night? Good. That was just a moment for me to think. 11 manuscripts, no, 10 manuscripts before the 11th was accepted. The first 10 were young adult manuscripts. And I first started writing when I was 16. So I was writing what I was reading. But I'm a millennial, so through my childhood, I was raised on those ideals, beliefs that you can be anything you want to be. And in fact, you should pursue that at the cost of all else. And I remember this moment when I sent off a letter to this kids book writer, Tamara Pierce. I don't know if anyone knows her. Sent her a letter or email from my old Tasmail email. Anyway, no, they can like Tasmail was the old school email. Tasmail. And I said, hey, I want to be a writer. And I was grade 6 at the time, and she wrote back and said, I think you can do it. And she it was really good because she said, I don't usually reply to anyone, but I'll reply to you. So she'd already qualified me as a writer. And I thought, yeah, I'm going to do it just to prove that, I can do it. So yeah, I wrote 10 manuscripts starting at 16. I wrote a book that year, got a taste for it. Something about writing for me is that it's my flow state. So in positive psychology or coaching, we talk about that flow state, which is when you're in the zone. And when you're in the zone, you lose track of all time, taste, temperature, and it's really, really therapeutic and it's addictive. Some people find it in writing or other art. So I found it in writing. I wrote a manuscript. I loved it. Tried to get it published. Got nowhere. Thought getting something published takes a really, really long time. Even if it is successful, there's years. So I'd send it off in the world, work on the next one. So I kind of built up this strategy. And there's also something called the sunk cost fallacy, or the gambler's fallacy, where the more you put into something, the more you're going to put into it till you get something back. And I'm not saying that played a massive part, but when you put your whole, what I want to be when I grow up, identity into one thing. On the way I traveled, I got a degree, I was doing good work as a counsellor, but that was what I wanted more than anything else. And finally I got it. I got the fairy tale beginning, I got the overnight success, 10 years in the making. And what drove me to do that was just I wanted it more than most.
The power of a dream. So, Neeraj, in your essay, you quote Freud's idea that dreams are the royal road to the unconscious. And I guess Freud is probably still the person that many of us think of when we think of psychiatry. He seems to sort of go in and out of fashion. Can you tell us, in contemporary psychiatry, what is the relationship between medication and the talking cure?
So, yeah, you're right. Freud is called the father of psychoanalysis because he gave the theory of mind with conscious, pre-conscious, and unconscious. And after that, a lot of psychological theories have come, and they all have their merits. So when it comes to contemporary psychiatry, the contemporary psychiatry is supposed to follow what we call biopsychosocial, and we can expand it to biopsychosocial lifestyle, which means bio means the biological aspects of mental health or mental illness, and often the medication treatment. But psycho is the psychological aspects and different types of counseling, different psychotherapies, and then social and lifestyle. And it is the social lifestyle where I would emphasize the most, because ultimately a lot of mental health issues, whether you label, some people are into making the diagnosis and others say, let's not label, let's just understand the human being in front of us. And whether you label or not, there's a lot of stress in our contemporary life, and that manifests as various symptoms, we may call it, or states of mind. as we've called the issue. And the first thing is to look at those external sources of stress and how we can manage the environment, or make our society can make accommodations, our work or uni or whatever it is, interpersonal relationships. So the focus in contemporary psychiatry is on those social and lifestyle interventions. And then come the psychotherapies, the different counselings, cognitive behavior therapy or interpersonal therapy or whatever it is. And I would go to the medication as relatively later as a last resort, or sometimes for serious mental health issues, you need combination of all of those. But then psychiatry is not supposed to be only biological or only medication. It is always a combination of medication, psychotherapy, and social and lifestyle interventions.
So then, of course, we have this burgeoning new field, well, going back a few decades, but with this huge resurgence at the moment of psychedelics. Kate, you write that some of what psychedelics can do is what psychotherapy aims to do. So it can help you access varied thoughts, it can help you change your behaviour. But psychedelics obviously go a lot deeper than that. Can you explain what we know so far about how they can improve mental health?
Look, I'd start by saying it is such a contested area, and people have very different views about what it can and can't do. But I haven't spent the last few months talking to a lot of the researchers who are doing the research, particularly in Australia. In my piece, I talk to a woman called Margaret Ross, who's the psychologist who's heading Australia's first ever approved trial. Sorry, can you hear me? First ever approved trial of psychedelic medicine, and that's happening at St Vincent's Hospital in Melbourne. And this is actually working with terminal patients, and it's really about trying to control or heal existential terror. Which and there's not normally. This whole conversation becomes so strange because there's not a lot of medicine. There's not a lot of pills you take to heal existential terror. When I spoke to Mark initially, they were just about to begin this whole process, and so this was like in March 2020. So I was pretty excited because I was planning on following this process through. And of course, what happened was they saw 2 patients and then it got shut down. But when I spoke to her about what happened when she saw those 2 patients, she's a psychologist, she's a clinical psychologist, she's worked in palliative care and oncology for a long time. She's sensible, she's lovely, but she's sensible. She doesn't normally cry when she sees her patients. And she was she was almost lost for words, talking to me, trying to describe the experiences that she had watching these patients. And she couldn't talk about their experiences. But over and over again, she kept on talking about the profundity of what she was watching. She was kind of describing these extraordinary psychological, emotional breakthroughs that her patients were having. She was talking about almost something like kind of states of grace, I suppose. So, instantly it takes it in, this becomes a different kind of conversation. And I think, one of the things I think that happens in those psychedelic encounters is that, or experiences, is that you do have this very profound, or you potentially have a very profound close encounter with the self. And I think in our culture and society, and maybe it's human nature, I don't know, but I think there is a lot of avoidance of the self, and Netflix is great for that. And so is alcohol and all sorts of things. And I think one of the interesting things about this conversation is it's a conversation about actually choosing to come closer to the self, but also that as part of that conversation, there's this central idea that rather than medicating to sort of tamp down symptoms, you actually have to be prepared to experience quite a degree of discomfort. You have this is a medicine that says you have to be prepared. You may be afraid. You may be very afraid. This may be painful psychologically. You may cry. But if you can embrace that process, things happen that you don't expect. And I have to be very. It's very easy to feel evangelical about it, and researching it, it's easy to feel that way. And at the same time, it's a drug. And in fact, it's not just a drug. The whole thing about what's happening here is it's unusual in that most medication, even though, Neeraj, I know you're saying, obviously, excuse me, good psychiatry happens, there's a context, there's a therapeutic process as well as a drug process. I think the thing with psychedelics is it's built in quite a specific way. There are a series of, sort of psychological preparatory sessions. Then you have what's known as dosing day. And then there's a process of which is really important, of consolidation afterwards. And in many ways, the consolidation is really probably the most important part of it. And the argument, what I keep hearing from researchers is that, essentially the psychedelic experience is like it shines a light. It's like you get this light switched on for a moment, or suddenly you're at the top of the mountain and the clouds clear for a moment. Excuse me. But it's the work that happens afterwards that changes you.
That's so interesting, that idea of the uncomfortableness of using psychedelics as a sort of therapeutic tool and having to confront what might be your worst fears, your worst nightmares. So how, obviously, if you're taking drugs recreationally, that's not what you're going for. So what is the difference between the clinical use of psychedelics and recreational? Is it just that it's very, very controlled?
I think there'd be two really main things. And the first thing is that in terms of the clinical use, there is a screening process, which means that there are quite a number of people who are not deemed suitable for these drugs in the first place. And I'm talking sort of particularly about psilocybin, which is mushrooms, is now the kind of psychedelic of choice. LSD is still very effective, but it's so stigmatized. No one actually wants to, it'll take a while. But I've just lost my track. Where was I? I've gone completely.
The two key things that.
So one is that, if you've had a history of psychosis, if you are schizophrenic, or if you have family members who are schizophrenic, if you have bipolar or whatever, at this stage you're excluded because the risks are too great that people will, that it will actually create serious harm. But I think the other thing that's really important is this idea that came out of sort of came out of the 60s, and it's been refined in this new wave of psychedelic research that really took off in about 2000. And it's this idea of set and setting. And it's that the mindset, the thoughts, the ideas, the questions that you take in, as well as the setting in which this experience happens, and that's the people it's happening with, the space you're in, the level of trust you're feeling, profoundly influence the experience. And because you've got therapists with you, who, if you're terrified, you can say, I am so scared. And you read reports of people saying, I'm so scared. And you've got a hand to hold, or you've got an instruction. The instruction is great, go towards it. You're okay, go towards whatever it is that's scaring you. And Marg Ross, she says, well, really, that's what makes the difference. That's the difference between a good trip and a bad trip. A bad trip is uncontrolled terror. A good trip can be extremely difficult, and I think that there have been times when there's always a risk, there's still a risk, but that containment is profoundly important.
I think that brings us back to the idea of the importance of the talking side of things, which Kyle comes through really strongly in your piece, this idea of counselling as the talking cure. And you even let readers know in your memoir when you're actually using specific counselling techniques like immediacy and challenging. You do that in your piece in a really lovely way. How does talk therapy help to draw out those unconscious thoughts?
I think something that's important to know is that until World War I, psychology as a discipline was more about philosophy. So it wasn't a medical model. There wasn't really mental ill health until that stage. And it was all about what is a good life? How do you achieve it? And that's because, you know, as humans, we lean more towards the philosophical element of being a human among humans. What talk therapy does is that all of us have about 20% of our lives that are a blind spot. And what talk therapy does is it takes your world, your words, and reflects it back to you so that you can see those blind spots. Or what it can do is it can reframe the story you're telling yourself. In a type of talk therapy we call narrative therapy. It talks about how, you know, if you say, oh man, I'm just scared all the time. I can't get out of bed, I can't go to work, everything's too much for me. Narrative therapy will say, well, tell me an example when you weren't scared. And originally it's like, no, this doesn't exist. But then you say, well, no, let's create a safe space, just one moment. And they identify that one moment. And you say, okay, so what you're telling me is you're not always scared. So you're telling yourself a lie. That's a blind spot. It's not 100% of the time. And by delving into those, it's not like you're not tricking people, but you're expanding, you're reframing, you're restoring their lives. But what I think is really important to know about talk therapy, and I'm a massive evangelist for talk therapy counselling. I suggest everyone do it, go get it. I get it as a counsellor. I have clinical supervision, which means I need to talk stuff out. The thing about talk therapy is you need someone who's good at it. Otherwise, it doesn't really work. And there's this really interesting statistic about counsellors and psychotherapists, which is that our first 50 hours of practice are our most effective, which is so different from pretty much every other industry or profession, is that you get better as you go. But the thing about talk therapy is that you learn skills, like I talk about in my piece, immediacy, affirming, reflecting, complex reflections. And at the start of your life as a counsellor, you're using them all the time. You're not judging, you're listening, you're leaning in, you're passionate, you're excited, you're bringing positivity. But then when you tip past that 50 hours, you hear a story and you think, oh, I've heard this one before. I know how this story ends. Let me tell you how it ends. Or they come in and they're like, oh, my life's falling apart. And you're like, oh, honey, is it really, do you know what I just listened to? Your story's not that sad. And just being honest, like as a human among humans, counselling is a repetitive strain injury. We're not made for that. We're not made to be continuous. It's not easy for me to sit across from someone and not give them advice or my own interpretation. As a number one rule of being a counsellor, don't give advice, which is so counterintuitive. And so if I'm sitting across from someone and they're saying, oh man, like my life is just falling apart and I don't know what to do, everything inside me wants to say, well, clearly, bro, you need to do this. Whereas a counsellor has to say, well, okay, tell me more. That's really interesting. Well, you must be feeling frustrated. Tell me about that frustration. Okay, like I'm not, and you have to not give your own opinion. That's how talk therapy works. And it's been branded the wrong way because the first psychologist I ever went to was fresh out of uni, and I'm afraid to say was not trained in talk therapy. I don't know what he was trained in, wasn't talk therapy. And he just gave me advice the whole time. And he told me, I don't know, like this weird analogy about how if I get like anxious, I should think of a shark with an eye patch. I'm not making this up. And I walked out of there feeling, man, I'm never going back. Whereas now, as stepping into the field, working as I did in drug and alcohol, it's so hard, and I get like why he struggled. But talk therapy only works if you draw awareness, and I can't give you awareness. You can only give yourself awareness. It was really that's lock that one in, Carrie. Awareness is therapeutic, and I can't give it to you, but talk therapy can.
That's fascinating, and that actually kind of segues us nicely into the next part of the discussion, moving away from dreams and the unconscious and subconscious to cold hard reality, some more negative elements of what you guys have written about. So, Neeraj, you were the clinical director of a mental health service in Queensland in 2012, and that was the year that the state government, led of course by everyone's favourite premier, Campbell Newman, introduced a really controversial locked door policy for adult mental health inpatient units in general hospitals. Could you tell us what was that policy and what were its consequences?
Thank you. So it was in 2013, and my essay is on psychiatry and the socio-political context. And this is an example of how the socio-political context influences the practice of psychiatry or medicine or every field. So in 2013, this Queensland government came up with this policy of what is called as locked wards policy, so that they said that all the psychiatry wards, acute psychiatry wards in public hospitals will be locked. Before that, there was the services had a discretion that we could have the wards open, or sometimes, if needed, depending upon the equity and various aspects on the wards could be locked. But then in 2013, or in some hospitals, some services, some wards were open, some psychiatry wards were open, and some were closed. But then the policy came that all wards have to be locked, blanket locked ward policy. And this was, and I've described in my essay that this was on the background of when we had all those BIFE laws and lots of things. We had a newspaper item, people, there was 3 or 4 BIFE gang members were arrested on the Gold Coast for eating ice cream together because more than 3 of them could not. This was against the law, the association. They could not, if you're a gang member, there can't be more than 4 of you in a public place together. So it was in that context. And the Courier Mail sensationalized that sort of that news policy. When the policy came, they said hundreds of rapists, mentally ill rapists and murderers are absconding from Queensland Health public hospital wards every year. And the police is very busy. Now, in some cases, the police did have to bring some patients back to the ward, but that was a minority. Generally, people go on leave. Like we don't have an institutional model anymore. Most people are on the ward for, let's say, 2 weeks. Our average length of stay is actually 11 days. So we're preparing everyone for discharge. That means the people come in for a short period, they go on leave, and sometimes if people did not decide to come back, that did not mean that people are absconding because the wards are open, but government interpreted it like that and came up with this law policy. The consequences, the psychiatric mental health ward is supposed to be a therapeutic environment, and the consequence was that from a therapeutic it became a custodial environment. And a lot of people who could, somebody had come in to the ward for depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation or something. People are being supported, but they also allowed to go out for a walk. And so now the therapeutic milieu of the wards changed with that policy. And the College of Australia, Royal Australian New Zealand College of Psychiatrists condemned that policy, and so did the Australian College of Nurses, Association of Social Workers, Queensland Mental Health Commission recommended some evidence-based policies rather than sort of risk-averse political agenda. But having said that, 3 election cycles and 8 years later, we still have all the Queensland mental health wards locked. Which is not the case in other states, Australia, where the services still have a discretion. So that is one of the realities. And I think sometimes when psychiatry, that is an example of how practice of psychiatry or health in general is influenced by the socio-political context behind the scene.
Thanks, Neeraj. Now, in shocking news, we are running swiftly out of time. So I'm going to skip ahead to my burnout round, which I think is going to have to be a rapid fire round. So, some of you in the audience may have seen that recently Guardian Australia, they did a call out to their readers and asked people to share their experiences of Australia's mental health system. And they had some pretty damning responses, long wait times, inadequate resources, the government's failure to address problems that lead to mental health issues in the first place, so things like poverty and abuse. So my question to all 3 of our wonderful panelists is, 1, do you think that we are in the midst of a mental health crisis? And 2, if so, how do we find our way out of it? Kate, let's throw to you.
Okay, I'm going to pass on the first part of that because I feel that there are people better qualified to answer that, except to say that, yeah, it kind of looks like it, let's face it, you know, and $200 billion worth of basically the health system has, you know, spends each year on mental health, suicide, and, you know, and the sort of money that's lost through that. So, yeah. You know, again, one of the things, and just listening to you guys talking, and it seems to me, you know, this conversation about context is really, really important. And, you know, context and skills. And, you know, in a sense, we can't move, we can't do anything without having it placed within a human context. And I love, Carl, the way you keep on talking about, what's that lovely line about the human?
Being humans amongst humans.
Yeah, being humans amongst humans. And I think that's really, really easy to forget. But, you know, and I suppose one of the things that interests me, you know, again, this conversation about psychiatry and also counselling, it's sort of like, you know, these ideas about sort of unlocking content, perhaps, that already exists. I mean, we carry this information in us and it's ways of opening us up. I guess, you know, coming back to the psychedelics kind of question, you know, one of the things that psychedelics supposedly do is, well, they know, they can see that they actually tone down or kind of, yeah, lower the volume on a sort of brain area and process known as the default mode network. And that's really, you know, that probably fits a little bit with the Freudian idea of ego. It's the part of ourselves that tells ourselves the stories about who we are. So back to narrative therapy as well. And in the toning down of that, you know, really interesting things come out. But ultimately, and I've been thinking, I'm going to wind up, but you know, the psychedelic thing is fascinating. I think it's got really interesting potential depending on what the trials show up. But ultimately, it's got to fit within a bigger, you know, in the context, and Neeraj talking about the sort of, you know, socio-political context. And, you know, for me, the big question about psychedelics is access. Who actually will get to take these, to have this therapy, which is basically, this is not, you know, there's a session, a psychedelic session takes, you know, 6 hours. You've got 3 hours of therapy beforehand, you've got 3 hours afterwards. You know, it's not cheap. Who's going to get it? Because at the moment, the people who are getting it are, you know, white, wealthy, and connected. So that's a question, not an answer.
So many questions. Kyle, what do you think?
I'll give you a short answer to the first question and a more involved answer to the second question. The first question is that, yes, mental health is a spectrum, so it's hard to quantify crisis. What I would say is we're in a sleep deprivation crisis. And if we were to address that, we'd see everything else lift. Yeah, none of us sleep as much as we should. It's one of the bedrocks of mental health. That was to increase as a society. Everything would increase. About finding our way out of mental health crisis, I'll be a little bit vulnerable and give you an example of what it is to work on the front lines of mental health. Tonight at 5:15, right before I was supposed to get in a taxi to come here, I got a phone call from a mental health professional who contacted me about an ex-client of mine who I'm still engaged with, and I'm down as his next of kin. So, not something that you should do, but it's more common than you think. And they basically said, look, there's real high potential suicidal ideation. Can you please give him a call as soon as you can? Now, I'm getting ready to come to an event. I'm living my life as a writer. I'm living the dream. Like I'm amongst my fellows here, up here, and then I get a call like that. So as a mental health professional, what do? Do I stop the taxi, give him a call? If he's gone by the end of this session, what does that mean for me? What does that mean for the person who called me? And this is not a rare occurrence. Neeraj will probably testify. This isn't rare. So we're talking about mental health like it's floating around. But it's not, it's every day, and people on the front lines have to make these calls, and we get burned out. You know, our first 50 hours a ton, you know, we almost need the mental health field to be like the army where you get conscripted. We need people like you with empathy and intelligence to step up and take part in this. And I'm not like pressing that on you, but I'm saying this is what's going on right now, tonight, for me as a mental health professional. If we need to come out of this crisis, it's a lot more complicated than you think.
Definitely. More sleep and conscription to solve it.
First, I'll very
Neeraj, I think you've got about 30 seconds to
Yes,
solve all
I'll
our
be
mental
brief.
health problems.
Yes, I will. I think first, positive psychology. At the tertiary care level, we see the news that not enough beds, ambulances ramping up. So yes, we need more resources. But then if we step back from the tertiary care, when it comes to community mental health care, if somebody said that every time a patient is admitted to the hospital, it's a failure of community mental health and primary care. So I would also like to emphasize throwing more resources at the community mental health care level and primary care, GPs, NGOs, social organizations, and community mental health care. And if we step back from that to the level of community, there is so much stress in our capitalist neoliberal world that has obviously got something to do with it at the grassroots levels. And the community, we say community mental health, but do we have a community? So our sense of community has broken down. We don't know our neighbors. We don't have a neighbor door, or so the professionals and psychiatrists, they probably can't just solve all the problems. We just have to somehow try to get that community spirit back. And yeah, there are no easy answers to that, but there are different layers to this issue. And I see that in the new budget, a lot of money has been thrown into mental health and suicide rate. So I'm yet to study that. But
I think we could keep talking all night, but it is time to throw to our wonderful audience for questions. Just a friendly reminder, please make sure that it's a question, not a statement, and please keep it short if you can, that would be wonderful. Does anyone have a burning question? Yep, you're in the front row.
Elements of the arts.
yeah, so the
It's connecting with self.
yeah, so the question is, how can art be used for therapy? And look, as I highlighted, the social and lifestyle interventions. So anything that people can do to connect themselves or have a time that provides some richness into their life, that's obviously very good for mental health, mental well-being. And I think that should be the first step to deal with mental health issues. And then in a stepwise manner, you would go for other interventions.
I think we have a Zoom question up next.
Thanks, everyone. Just doing a little tag team with our Zoom. The question we received from Zoom was, it's been raised about the power of talk. What about the power of reading?
So that's a great
Got
question.
my book.
Let me refer you to a really good novel. When you uses a whole different part of your brain. When you read a novel, you lose track of where you are. You're immersed in experiences that you wouldn't otherwise get. So the empathy and the stimulation to your imagination and the growth it has to your brain is actually, like, there's a big body of research about it. You can look into it. But reading, when I'm talking about long form, I can't speak to any other forms, but reading long form prose, long form books has a definite positive effect on your mental health.
Chrissy?
I've got a question for Kate. Because have you done any research into microdosing on psilocybin? Because you don't need that same follow-up, you don't need all that kind of time, so it's not as expensive.
It's a look, in the end, I didn't do a lot. I know that there is some research coming out on that, or sort of underway at the moment, and I think it's a whole other really interesting area and question, and I know a lot of people are self-microdosing now, and yes, I don't know the answer, but I'm kind of interested.
That's your next essay.
Yeah, well, I'm sort of thinking maybe we're looking at a bit of a book now, so
Hey.
who knows? We'll see. We'll see. Can I just say one thing really quickly though on the reading? One of the things that really struck me, there have been times in my life when, that in extremis, and, I had very big back surgery about a decade ago, the thing that actually created the bridge between my old self, the person before I had a kilo of metal in my back, and my new self, when there was nothing else that could do it, was actually reading. It was finding spaces of people who could connect parts of myself to new parts of myself. And I think it's so, this whole idea that it's an indulgence, that it's a middle class preoccupation. It's just like, it's medicine.
Just a quick reminder that we're at a bookshop, so you can all buy lots of books on your way out. Last question, Lockie.
All right. Mine's for you as well. Okay. I think it's two-part. I'm going to try to get to. Why do you think psychedelics were legalized in the first place? And if a part of that answer is to do with, it obviously being without trials, out of control, and obviously the public being maintained and put under control by laws and the government. If that is part of the case, and that is truth, what effect do you think that governmental desire to control and take over an individual's right over their own consciousness has? Do you think that also impacts mental illness in its own way?
How long have we got?
I think that was too far. Start with the first question.
I think
Why was it
on the
legalized?
It was made illegal in the US under Nixon because it was linked to the counterculture, and it was, it's interesting that the research they do on psychedelics is basically, there's a philosopher a British philosopher who I was reading recently, and he was saying, the questions of consent become very difficult under psychedelics, because he said, how do you give consent to something that by the time this process is finished, you may not recognise the person who gave consent originally? People can change fundamental attitudes, and also people's attitudes tend to shift leftward. So it's inherently a political process. This could go on forever, this conversation. It's so interesting. I don't know the answers. I've just got questions, really.
Because I think I thought of it because one of the main things was in the book. It talked about some of the criticisms not being so against the research itself, but the manner in which it was done, because they feared that it would just get kind of cancelled or written off in the same way that others did. So obviously, it's on the way to reading that you kind of have to edge around in the most careful process, because it's a drop of a hat. It could be shut down.
It's very, very stigmatized. But also, I think one of the things, it's also, there is this, one of the things that's come through to me is this unbelievable hunger for these drugs. And it's this, all of the researchers I'm talking to are just saying, we are blitzed, we are overwhelmed with, we're being rung at midnight by people who want the drugs. They want the drugs for someone else. They want, so I think there's a kind of, and there's all sorts of questions about, the extent to which they can or can't, but I think that there is a hunger for meaning, which is, which people are turning towards the idea of these drugs for, and that could be both healthy and unhealthy, and is potentially risky. But most of the researchers who I spoke to also say fundamentally they don't even think, and these are the people who are saying we need to do the research, but they're also saying we don't think these drugs should be, they should never have been put on the TGA in the first place. So, well,
one more question from Zoom, and it'll be a lightning quick answer, I think.
Fire away.
So the last question will go to from Zoom. Again, I will make it a light and quick answer, but we wanted to squeeze this one in. It does relate to the power of reading. But what is the power of being read to? Most of us have experiences in childhood of having a bedtime story read to us. Talking about a living, physical person, not an audio book. Is there research on this being a benefit to mental health?
I'll give a quick answer, Neeraj, I know more, but there is something inside you called the polyvagal nerve, and it helps you regulate your emotions, it helps you regulate your stress, and how it's actually activated is by the sound of human voice. So when you hear people reading to you in that soft, modulating tone, and that itself is therapeutic. And then obviously there's the narrative benefits of, again, bringing different ideas to your brain that you have no other way to access. So like we know that the feeling you get watching, a horror movie is the same feeling you get if you're in those shoes. Probably not the pain, but that fear can be the same. And so growing up with a young budding mind, not only getting soothed, and so you're associating being soothed with being read to by the human voice, you're also building up a wider, broader perspective.
I think we might leave it there. Thank you. We'll note. We'll end on a bang and boom, science. That was fantastic. I hope you've all enjoyed our panel discussion for Griffith Review 72 States of Mind as much as I have. Yep. I'd like to just give a very quick thank you also to those in the audience who have joined us from Griffith Review, Ashley Hay and Marizan and Aisha, who were here before, and supporting partners. Thank you everyone also for just showing up, and those who have Zoomed, thank you for being with us tonight for this very special event. I'm going to get everyone to move inside, but let's give a warm round of applause, please, for first of all our performance poets. Everyone, basically just take your seats while we bring our panel members inside, so it's not all a big rush. And thank you, and have a lovely evening. Thank you.
Yeah, we should have a chat.